The golden glow of string lights danced across Clara's scarred cheek as she swayed in Ethan's arms, her hand trembling against his shoulder. Around them, the Maplewood Summer Fair hummed with laughter and carousel music, but all sound seemed to fade beneath "The Way You Look Tonight," floating from the makeshift stage. For the first time in 14 years, she wasn't hiding. Her fingers instinctively moved toward her face, but Ethan's gentle voice stopped her cold. "You don't need to hide. Everyone has their own inner beauty, and everyone shines in their own way." 20 feet away, Mr. Harrison stood frozen, watching his daughter's radiant smile, a smile he hadn't seen since the accident that changed everything. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened. Because in that moment, a small-town waiter had given his daughter something his millions never could. But this dance would shatter more than just his pride. To understand how this single moment could crack the foundation of a man who built empires, we need to go back 3 days earlier. Back to when Maplewood was just another forgotten dot on the map for Harrison Industries, and when Ethan Collins was simply trying to make it through another shift at Maple Grove Diner. The summer air hung thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and barbecue smoke as the town buzzed with preparations for their annual 4-day fair. Banners stretched between lamp-posts, vendors hammered together booths, and children pressed their noses against windows, counting down hours until the festivities began. Ethan wiped down the counter for the 3rd time that morning, his movements automatic after years of perfecting small-town service. At 34, he carried himself with quiet confidence earned through sleepless nights, when 9-year-old Benji ran fevers or had nightmares about the mother he barely remembered. The bell above the diner door chimed its familiar greeting as Mrs. Peterson shuffled in for her daily coffee and gossip session. "That Harrison fellow's coming to town tomorrow," she announced, settling onto her favorite stool with practiced authority. "Heard he's looking to buy the old textile plant." The black limousine appeared just after the lunch rush, sliding through Maplewood's main street like a shark in a goldfish bowl. Ethan glanced up from the grill as the vehicle parked directly in front of his diner, its chrome bumper reflecting afternoon sun in aggressive angles. Mr. Harrison stepped out first, his charcoal suit impeccable despite the heat, silver hair swept back in a style that probably cost more than Ethan made in a week. But it was the woman who followed that made his breath catch. She moved like someone trying to disappear into shadows that weren't there, auburn hair falling in a curtain across the right side of her face, a silk scarf wrapped around her neck despite the summer heat, and she kept her head down as they approached the entrance. Even through the window, Ethan could sense her reluctance, the way she hesitated before following her father inside. The bell's cheerful chime seemed almost mocking as they entered, breaking the comfortable quiet. Conversation stuttered to a halt as every head turned to assess the newcomers. Mr. Harrison surveyed the modest interior with calculating eyes while his daughter slipped into the corner booth, positioning herself so the wall shielded her from curious stares. Ethan approached their table with menus and his best professional smile, the kind that had earned him loyal customers for years. "Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Maple Grove Diner. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Mr. Harrison barely glanced at him, attention focused on his phone screen. "Coffee. Black. Make sure it's fresh, not something that's been sitting around all day." His tone carried casual dismissiveness of someone who had never worked service, never understood that politeness cost nothing. The woman kept her face turned toward the wall, voice barely above a whisper. "Just water, please, with lemon." Something in her voice reminded Ethan of wounded animals he had found as a child. There was a quality of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, to ask for the smallest favors. As he returned with their drinks, he noticed how she had positioned salt and pepper shakers to create a small barrier between herself and other diners. Her hands, delicate but strong, bore no rings or polish, and she gripped her water glass like it might anchor her to something solid. Mr. Harrison was deep in phone conversation, discussing profit margins and acquisition timelines with casual authority of someone who viewed the world as transactions waiting to happen. The bell chimed again, and Benji burst through the door with boundless energy that only 9-year-olds possessed after being cooped up in school all day. His backpack hit the floor with a satisfying thump as he scrambled onto his usual stool, face flushed from the short bike ride from school. "Dad, Mrs. Chen says the fair's going to have a ring toss this year, and Jimmy's dad is running the dunking booth." He paused mid-sentence, attention caught by the elegantly dressed strangers. With fearless curiosity that adults spent lifetimes trying to recapture, he hopped down and approached their table. "Hi there. I'm Benji. Are you here for the summer fair? It starts tomorrow night and it's going to be amazing. There's going to be dancing and games, and Mrs. Peterson always brings her famous apple pie." His enthusiasm filled the space like sunshine breaking through clouds, and for the first time since entering, the woman looked up. Ethan watched from behind the counter, coffee pot frozen in his hand, as his son's genuine warmth worked its particular magic on someone who clearly wasn't used to unguarded kindness. Her lips curved into what might have been the beginning of a smile, though she quickly ducked her head when she noticed Ethan watching. Mr. Harrison ended his phone call with sharp efficiency, attention finally focusing on the boy beside their table. "Son, we're trying to have a private conversation here. Perhaps you should return to your father." The dismissal was polite, but firm, the kind of boundary that wealthy men drew around themselves like invisible fences. But Benji, blessed with childhood resilience, wasn't easily discouraged. "Oh, that's my dad over there. He makes the best grilled cheese in the whole county. What's your name?" He paused, realizing he didn't know. "You should come to the fair tomorrow. There's going to be music and dancing, and everyone comes." "Clara," she said softly, and something in the way she spoke her own name suggested it had been a while since she'd introduced herself to anyone. "That sounds nice." Mr. Harrison's phone buzzed again, pulling his attention back to the screen, but not before Ethan caught the flash of irritation that crossed his features. Clearly the man wasn't accustomed to his daughter engaging with strangers, especially people he'd encounter in a place like Maplewood. Ethan moved closer, resting a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Sorry about that, folks. He gets excited about the fair. It's pretty much the highlight of our summer around here." Benji looked up at his father with bright eyes, then back at Clara. "You should definitely come. Everyone's really nice, and nobody cares about, well, anything really. We just have fun." The innocence of the statement hit the table like a small bomb. Clara's hand instinctively moved toward her scarf, and Mr. Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But there was something else in Clara's expression now, a flicker of longing that she couldn't quite hide. Ethan recognized it because he'd seen it in his own mirror during dark months after his wife's death. The desperate hunger for normalcy, for connection, for simple pleasure of being around people who didn't walk on eggshells. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the moment like a blade. "We're in town on business. We won't be staying long." But Benji, with persistence of someone who hadn't yet learned that some doors were meant to stay closed, pressed on. "But you're staying overnight, right?" The fair doesn't really get good until the second night, anyway. That's when they have the dancing. Ethan watched Clara's reaction to the word dancing, saw the way her breath caught and her fingers tightened around her water glass. There was a story there, written in the careful way she held herself, in protective positioning of her body, in the scarf that seemed less like fashion choice and more like armor. Mr. Harrison was about to respond when his phone rang again, the sharp electronic sound demanding immediate attention. He answered with brisk efficiency, his conversation filled with terms like acquisition parameters and due diligence protocols. While her father was distracted, Clara looked directly at Benji for the first time, and Ethan caught a glimpse of her face in profile. The right side bore unmistakable marks of old burn scars, the skin slightly puckered and discolored in patterns that spoke of serious trauma survived and endured. But what struck him wasn't the scarring itself. It was the way she carried it, like a burden she'd grown so accustomed to bearing that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Benji, to his credit, didn't stare or recoil. He simply smiled, the same genuine smile he'd been wearing since he walked in, proof that children often possessed wisdom that adults spent years trying to rediscover. "The dancing's the best part," he continued, as if nothing had changed. "My dad taught me how to waltz last year, but I'm still pretty terrible at it. He says it's all about listening to the music and not stepping on your partner's feet." Clara's smile became a little more real, a little more present. "I used to dance," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of memory. "A long time ago." Mr. Harrison ended his call and immediately launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about their timeline and responsibilities. But Ethan found himself tuning out the businessman's words. Instead, he watched Clara's face as Benji chatted about the fair, noting the way her expression softened when his son described carousel horses and the smell of kettle corn. There was something achingly familiar about her careful posture, the way she seemed to be simultaneously present and absent, engaged but ready to flee at first sign of unwelcome attention. He'd seen that same protective stance in the mirror during his early days of widowhood, when every social interaction felt like navigating a minefield. As evening approached and the dinner crowd began filtering in, the dynamic in the corner booth shifted subtly. Mr. Harrison's initial assessment of the diner as beneath his standards seemed to give way to grudging acknowledgement that the food was competent and the service adequate. More importantly, his daughter appeared more relaxed than she had since their arrival, her shoulders less rigid, her voice a little stronger when she thanked Ethan for refilling her water glass. When Benji mentioned that the fair's opening ceremony would include a performance by the high school jazz band, Clara's interest was unmistakable. "They're actually really good," Benji assured her, with the seriousness of a music critic. Mr. Harrison checked his watch, an elegant piece that probably cost more than most Maplewood residents made in a month, and announced that they would be staying at the Marriott in the county seat, about 30 minutes away. But as they prepared to leave, his phone rang again, and this time the conversation took on a different tone. Contract delays, missing documentation, the need for additional meetings with local officials, the kind of bureaucratic tangles that could extend a planned overnight trip into several days. Clara watched her father's growing frustration with what might have been relief, though she was careful not to let it show too obviously. When he finally ended the call, his expression was grim. "We'll be staying through the weekend." Apparently, small-town government operates on its own schedule. Benji's face lit up like Christmas morning. "That's perfect. You'll be here for the whole fair. The best stuff happens on the weekend anyway. Saturday night is when they have the real dancing, with the good band and everything." Clara's reaction was immediate and complex, a flash of something that looked like excitement, followed quickly by anxiety and retreat. Her hand moved to her scarf again, adjusting it with unconscious precision of long practice. Mr. Harrison gathered his things with efficient movements of someone who had learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, though his displeasure at the delay was obvious. As they prepared to leave, Clara turned back to Benji with a shy smile. "Maybe I'll see you at the fair," she said, and the simple statement carried more hope than seemed reasonable for such a small promise. After they left, the diner felt strangely quiet despite the usual evening rush. Ethan found himself replaying the afternoon's interactions as he served coffee and took orders, trying to understand why this particular encounter had affected him so deeply. There was something about Clara's careful movements, her protective gestures, that resonated with his own experience of learning to navigate the world as someone carrying invisible wounds. Benji, apparently unbothered by class differences or social barriers, had already begun planning what games he would show Clara and how he might convince his father to teach her the waltz if she wanted to learn. She seemed sad, he announced as Ethan helped him with homework at the counter. But not mean sad. Just lonely sad, like she's forgotten how to have fun. The observation, delivered with matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed, hit closer to home than Ethan cared to admit. The next day dawned bright and clear, with the kind of perfect summer weather that made even the most elaborate plans seem effortless. Maplewood transformed itself with efficiency of a town that had been hosting this fair for over 50 years, vendors setting up booths with practiced ease while volunteers strung additional lights and tested sound systems. The smell of funnel cake and caramel apples already drifted through the air, mixing with the green scent of fresh-cut grass and distant sound of carnies assembling rides. Ethan worked the morning shift with one eye on the clock, his usual efficiency sharpened by anticipation he couldn't quite name. The fair officially opened at 6, but by 5:30 the streets around the town square were already crowded with families, claiming the best spots for the opening ceremony. Ethan and Benji arrived early, partly out of habit, and partly because his son had been ready to leave since noon. The transformation was remarkable. Their quiet town square had become a wonderland of colored lights, game booths, and controlled chaos that made small-town fairs magical. The high school jazz band was tuning up on the makeshift stage, their instruments gleaming under string lights that turned ordinary oak trees into something from a fairy tale. At 6:15, just as the mayor was wrapping up his traditional opening remarks about community spirit and summer traditions, Ethan spotted the black limousine navigating slowly through the crowd. Clara emerged first this time, and the difference in her appearance was subtle but significant. She still wore the protective scarf, but her dress was lighter, more summery, and she moved with less of the careful tension that had marked her steps in the diner. Mr. Harrison followed, his expression suggesting a man fulfilling an obligation rather than someone planning to enjoy himself. He wore slacks and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's entire wardrobes. "Clara, you came." Benji's voice carried over the general noise as he bounded toward them with single-minded focus of a guided missile. "You have to see the ring toss, and there's a guy making balloon animals, and the jazz band is going to play in like 10 minutes. His enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles from nearby families who recognized universal joy of a child at his first fair. Clara laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine, cutting through the evening air like music. Mr. Harrison's reaction was more complicated, a mixture of protective concern and something that looked almost like surprise, as if he hadn't heard his daughter laugh in years. Ethan approached more slowly, giving Clara space to maintain whatever boundaries she needed while making it clear that both she and her father were welcome. "Evening, folks. Beautiful night for a fair." His greeting was casual, friendly without being presumptuous, the kind of small-town warmth that put most people at ease. Clara's smile was shy but real as she returned his greeting, and even Mr. Harrison managed a polite nod, though his attention was clearly divided between his daughter's obvious pleasure and his own discomfort at being surrounded by what he probably considered common people. The jazz band struck up their first number, a classic swing tune that immediately set feet tapping throughout the crowd. Benji grabbed Clara's hand with casual confidence of childhood friendship, leading her towards the game booths while explaining the finer points of fair strategy. The trick is to start with the easy games to build up your confidence, then work your way up to the really hard ones that have the best prizes. As they moved through the crowd, Ethan noticed how people reacted to Clara's presence. In a larger city, her scars might have drawn stares or uncomfortable attention, but Maplewood's residents had small-town courtesy of looking without gawking. Mrs. Peterson complimented her dress. The teenager running the basketball toss asked if she wanted to try her luck, and Mr. Chen offered her a sample of his famous grilled corn, all without making her feel like a curiosity or an object of pity. It was exactly the kind of casual acceptance that Clara seemed to hunger for, and with each interaction she stood a little taller, smiled a little more freely. Mr. Harrison followed at a distance, his phone buzzing constantly with calls and messages that he handled with practiced efficiency while keeping one eye on his daughter's progress through the fair. His expression was difficult to read, part protective father, part successful businessman assessing an unfamiliar social environment, part something else that looked almost like longing. When Clara won a small stuffed animal at the ring toss, her delighted laughter drew his full attention, and for a moment his professional mask slipped to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. Ethan recognized the expression because he'd worn it himself during Benji's early years after Maria's death. The bittersweet joy of watching your child experience happiness while being acutely aware of all the simple pleasures they'd been denied. The evening progressed with easy rhythm of a well-organized community event. Clara tried her hand at various games with varying degrees of success, her competitive spirit emerging as she discovered that she was surprisingly good at the milk bottle toss. Benji appointed himself her unofficial coach and cheerleader, offering advice on technique while celebrating every small victory with enthusiasm of someone witnessing Olympic achievements. Other children gradually joined their group, drawn by Benji's natural ability to make friends and Clara's gentle responses to their questions and comments. She seemed genuinely surprised by their easy acceptance. As the sun set and the string lights took on greater importance in illuminating the fair, the atmosphere shifted toward something more magical and intimate. The jazz band announced their final set, promising music suitable for dancing, and couples began claiming space near the makeshift stage. Clara watched the preparations with obvious longing, her fingers unconsciously tapping out rhythms against her thigh. When Benji asked if she knew how to dance, she nodded with a wistful smile. "I used to love dancing," she admitted, before everything changed. The statement hung in the air like an invitation to ask questions that everyone was too polite to voice. But before anyone could respond, the band struck up, "The Way You Look Tonight," and something shifted in the air around them. The melody was achingly beautiful, played with the kind of skill that elevated a high school jazz band into something approaching professional quality. Couples moved on to the improvised dance floor with easy confidence of people who had been dancing together for years, and the sight of their synchronized movements filled Clara's expression with naked longing. Ethan watched her internal struggle, recognizing the battle between desire and fear that he'd fought countless times since Maria's death. There had been so many moments when he'd wanted to rejoin the world but held back, convinced that his grief or his circumstances or his responsibilities made him unwelcome in normal social situations. It had taken time and practice and patient encouragement of friends like Mrs. Peterson to learn that most people were more accepting than he'd given them credit for. Now, watching Clara stand on the edge of the dance floor like someone staring at water they desperately wanted to enter, but were afraid might be too deep, he made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. "Clara, he said quietly, stepping beside her with casual confidence that came from years of reading people's needs and responding appropriately. "Would you like to dance?" The invitation was simple, direct, without fanfare or dramatic gestures that might make her feel pressured or self-conscious. Around them, the fair continued its gentle chaos of games and laughter, but the space near the bandstand had taken on intimate atmosphere of a community coming together to celebrate one of life's simplest pleasures. Clara looked at him with wide eyes, her hand automatically moving toward her scarf in the protective gesture he'd already learned to recognize. People will look," she said, and the uncertainty in her voice broke his heart a little. "Some might," Ethan acknowledged honestly, because he'd learned that false reassurances helped no one. "But most folks here are too busy enjoying themselves to pay much attention to anyone else. And those who do look, well, they'll see a beautiful woman dancing with someone who'd be honored to be her partner." The words were simple, honest, delivered without the kind of flowery language that might have made them seem insincere. Clara studied his face, as if trying to determine whether he meant what he said or was simply being kind. Mr. Harrison, who had been monitoring his daughter's interactions from a careful distance, stepped forward with protective instincts of a father who had spent years shielding his child from potential hurt. "Clara, perhaps we should—" But his daughter, for the first time since their arrival in Maplewood, interrupted him with gentle firmness. "I'd like to try," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Just for one song." The defiance was quiet but unmistakable, the first sign of the person she might have been if circumstances had been different. Ethan extended his hand with patient courtesy of someone who understood that some invitations required courage to accept. Clara hesitated for one more moment, her eyes searching the crowd as if calculating the potential cost of this moment of boldness. Then, with movements that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone else, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were warm but trembling slightly, and Ethan could feel the rapid pulse at her wrist that betrayed her nervousness despite her outward composure. As they moved toward the space that served as a dance floor, other couples made room with unconscious courtesy of people who understood that sometimes it took extraordinary courage to do ordinary things. Ethan's first priority was making Clara feel safe and comfortable, so he positioned them at the edge of the dance area where she would have easy escape routes if she became overwhelmed. His hold was gentle but confident, giving her structure without constraint, and he waited for her to find her rhythm before attempting any movements that might challenge her balance or comfort. At first she danced with careful precision, her attention divided between the music and the crowd around them, but gradually the familiar patterns began to assert themselves. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. "You're a beautiful dancer," Ethan said quietly, and she looked up at him with surprise, as if the compliment were completely unexpected. "I haven't danced in years," she admitted. "I wasn't sure I'd remember how." But her feet were already finding the rhythm with increasing confidence, and her posture had straightened into elegant lines that suggested years of formal training. As they moved together, Ethan became aware of the subtle ways she tried to position herself to minimize the visibility of her scars, turning slightly to keep her right side away from the crowd, angling her face to catch the light more favorably. Halfway through the song, something shifted. Perhaps it was the music, or the gentle encouragement in Ethan's eyes, or simply the intoxicating feeling of moving in harmony with another person. But Clara's defensive positioning began to dissolve. She stopped trying to hide her scars and started focusing entirely on the dance, her movements becoming more fluid and natural with each passing measure. Her smile, when it came, was radiant and genuine, transforming her entire face in ways that had nothing to do with physical perfection and everything to do with joy finally given permission to surface. The crowd around them seemed to sense the significance of the moment, conversations growing quieter as people became aware they were witnessing something special. Benji watched from the sidelines with proprietary pride of someone who had facilitated this moment through his simple faith in human goodness. Other children had gathered around him, drawn by his obvious excitement, and their presence created a small cheering section that offered encouragement without judgment. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even the teenagers who usually considered adult activities beneath their notice paused their own conversations to watch Clara's transformation. But it was Mr. Harrison's reaction that would ultimately define the evening's significance. He stood approximately 20 feet away, initially maintaining the watchful distance of a protective father monitoring a potentially risky situation. His expression cycled through concern, surprise, and something that looked like recognition as he watched his daughter dance with an ease and joy he hadn't seen in over a decade. The businessman who had built an empire through careful control and calculated risk assessment found himself watching his greatest treasure. His daughter's happiness flourish in circumstances he never would have chosen or predicted. His hands, usually busy with phone calls or documents, hung motionless at his sides as he absorbed the full impact of seeing Clara smile without reservation for the first time since the accident that had changed both their lives. As the song approached its conclusion, Clara made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of trying to maintain her careful positioning, she allowed Ethan to guide her through a gentle spin that brought her face fully into the light, scars visible to anyone who chose to look. The gesture was small, but monumentally significant, a moment of choosing trust over fear, connection over protection. The crowd's response was everything she could have hoped for and nothing she had feared. Warm applause that celebrated her courage rather than her appearance, smiles that reflected shared joy rather than pity or uncomfortable fascination. When the final notes faded and Ethan bowed formally over her hand, Clara was glowing with happiness that seemed to illuminate the space around her. The applause continued longer than usual, fueled by the community's recognition that they had witnessed something remarkable, not just a dance, but a transformation, a moment when someone chose courage over comfort and found themselves embraced rather than rejected. For Clara, the dance had been a revelation proof that her scars didn't define her in the eyes of people who chose to see her as a whole person rather than a collection of injuries. She had expected judgment and found acceptance, anticipated awkwardness and discovered grace, feared rejection and encountered embrace. The realization that she could participate in normal social activities without becoming an object of curiosity or pity was intoxicating, opening possibilities she had closed off years ago. As families began cleaning up their picnic areas and children reluctantly acknowledged the evening's end, Clara found herself making plans to return for the next night's activities. Mr. Harrison's silence during the drive back to their hotel was profound and complicated. The man who conducted his professional life through constant communication phone calls, emails, conferences, negotiations, found himself without words adequate to process what he had witnessed. His daughter, who had spent years carefully managing her public appearances and social interactions, had chosen to dance in full view of dozens of strangers and had been rewarded with acceptance rather than judgment. The small-town community that he had dismissed as unsophisticated and provincial had offered his daughter something he had been unable to provide despite all his wealth and power. The revelation was both humbling and painful. For years he had assumed that his role was to protect Clara from the world's potential cruelty, to create safe spaces where she wouldn't have to confront stares or awkward questions about her appearance. His intentions had been loving, but the result had been a kind of benevolent imprisonment that had robbed her of opportunities for growth and connection. Watching her bloom under the gentle encouragement of a small-town waiter and his son had forced him to confront the possibility that his protective instincts had become obstacles to his daughter's happiness. That night, as Clara fell asleep with a smile still lingering on her face, Mr. Harrison stood at the window of his hotel room, staring out at the distant glow of Maplewood's lights. The town that had seemed so insignificant that morning now loomed large in his consciousness as a place where his daughter had rediscovered joy. The businessman who prided himself on understanding market forces and human motivations found himself grappling with variables he hadn't considered: the power of simple kindness, the value of community acceptance, the healing potential of environments where people were judged by their character rather than their circumstances. The next morning brought a series of phone calls that should have demanded Mr. Harrison's full attention: contract negotiations, board meetings, market analyses that could affect millions of dollars in revenue. But he found his focus repeatedly drifting to Clara's animated descriptions of the previous evening's activities and her excited plans for the fair's continuation. She spoke with more enthusiasm than he had heard in years, her voice carrying the kind of energy that came from genuine anticipation rather than polite social obligation. When she asked if they could stay for the entire weekend rather than leaving after his business was concluded, her request carried a quality of hope that he hadn't heard since before the accident. The second day of the fair dawned with the promise of even better weather and larger crowds. Clara's preparation process was markedly different from the careful armor-building that usually preceded her public appearances. She chose brighter colors, spent less time adjusting her protective scarf, and moved with confident anticipation of someone looking forward to seeing friends rather than enduring social obligations. When Benji appeared at their hotel with a hand-drawn map of the fair's best attractions and a detailed schedule of recommended activities, Clara's laughter filled the hotel lobby with genuine delight. The afternoon brought new challenges and revelations as Clara navigated increasingly complex social situations with growing confidence. She joined a group of children attempting to win prizes at the ring toss, offered advice to teenagers struggling with the basketball game, and engaged in lengthy conversations with elderly residents who shared stories about Maplewood's history and traditions. Each interaction reinforced the lesson of the previous evening that her scars were only as significant as she allowed them to be, that most people were capable of seeing past surface imperfections to appreciate the person underneath. As evening approached and the crowd began gathering for the second night's musical entertainment, the atmosphere carried extra anticipation. Word had spread about the previous night's magical dance between the visiting CEO's daughter and the local diner owner, creating a sense of expectation that something special might happen again. Clara seemed aware of the attention without being intimidated by it, her newfound confidence allowing her to acknowledge curious glances with gracious nods rather than defensive retreats. When the band began their opening set, she positioned herself near the dance area with clear intention of participating rather than merely observing. When "The Way You Look Tonight" began for the second time in 2 nights, the crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations paused, couples moved aside to create space, and all eyes turned toward Clara and Ethan with expectant joy of people anticipating a repeat performance of something beautiful. But this time, Clara's response was markedly different from the night before. Instead of hesitation and nervous glances, she stepped into Ethan's arms with confidence of someone who had already proven she belonged in this space. Her posture was elegant from the first note, her movements fluid and natural, her smile radiant and unguarded from the beginning. The transformation was complete and remarkable. Where the previous night had been about overcoming fear and discovering acceptance, this dance was about celebrating connection and embracing joy. Clara had shed the last remnants of her protective shell, allowing herself to be fully present in the moment, without reservation or apology. Her scars were visible, but irrelevant, acknowledged but not defining, present but not limiting. The crowd's appreciation was immediate and heartfelt, but it was Mr. Harrison's reaction that would ultimately define the evening's significance. He had positioned himself closer to the dance floor this time, drawn by fascination and something that looked like pride as he watched his daughter's confident participation in the community celebration. But as the dance progressed and Clara's joy became increasingly radiant, his expression began to shift in ways that surprised even him. The businessman who had built his identity around control and success found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. His daughter's happiness had been facilitated not by his wealth or protection, but by the simple kindness of people he had initially dismissed as beneath his notice. The realization hit him like a physical blow. For years, he had operated under the assumption that his resources and influence were the primary tools for ensuring Clara's well-being. He had hired the best doctors, arranged for private tutors, created protected environments where she wouldn't have to face the potential cruelty of an unforgiving world. But watching her dance with such obvious joy in the arms of a small-town waiter, surrounded by people who accepted her without reservation, he was forced to acknowledge that his protective strategies had been more about his own need to feel useful than her actual needs for connection and community. As the song reached its climax, Clara threw back her head and laughed with pure, unrestrained delight, her scars fully illuminated by the string lights but completely irrelevant to anyone watching. The sight of his daughter experiencing such complete joy should have filled Mr. Harrison with parental pride, but instead it triggered a profound sense of loss and regret. How many years had they wasted in careful isolation? How many opportunities for connection and growth had he denied her in his misguided attempts at protection? The questions multiplied in his mind, each one carrying the weight of missed possibilities and misdirected love. When the dance ended and Clara curtsied to acknowledge the crowd's enthusiastic applause, Mr. Harrison felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart breaking, but his pride. The rigid structure of beliefs and assumptions that had governed his approach to parenting and business began to crumble under the weight of seeing his daughter thrive in circumstances he never would have chosen. The small-town waiter he had initially dismissed with barely concealed condescension had given Clara something priceless: the confidence to be herself without apology, the joy of being accepted for who she was rather than what she represented. Mr. Harrison approached Ethan as the crowd dispersed, his usual commanding presence subdued by something that looked like humility. The conversation that followed would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, worth, and the meaning of a life well lived. "Mr. Collins," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual corporate authority, "I owe you an apology. And my gratitude. In ways I'm still trying to understand, you've given my daughter something I couldn't provide despite all my resources and good intentions." The admission came with difficulty, each word requiring him to acknowledge assumptions and prejudices he was only beginning to recognize. Ethan's response was characteristically gracious, deflecting credit while acknowledging the significance of what had occurred. "Clara did all the hard work herself, Mr. Harrison. She just needed people willing to see past the surface to appreciate who she really is. That's not about money or status. It's about recognizing that everyone has something valuable to offer if we're open to receiving it." The simple statement carried profound implications that Mr. Harrison was only beginning to grasp, suggesting that his entire worldview might need fundamental reconstruction. The drive back to their hotel that final night was filled with Clara's animated plans for future visits and her gratitude for an experience that had changed her life in ways she was still discovering. But Mr. Harrison's silence was different, not distracted or processing, but thoughtful and determined. The revelation that his protective strategies had been counterproductive rather than helpful required not just acknowledgement, but action. If his daughter's happiness depended on connection and community rather than isolation and protection, then his entire approach to parenting needed fundamental revision. 3 months later, Clara returned to Maplewood for the first time, but not as a reluctant daughter accompanying her father on business. Instead, she came as Harrison Industries' official community liaison, tasked with overseeing the Foundation's partnership projects and ensuring that development efforts genuinely served local needs, rather than simply extracting maximum value from available resources. Her arrival was greeted with genuine celebration by friends who had maintained regular correspondence and had followed her continued transformation through letters and phone calls. The reunion at Maple Grove Diner was particularly meaningful, as Ethan and Benji had become not just friends, but correspondents whose regular letters had provided encouragement and connection during Clara's ongoing process of rebuilding her life and relationships. The young woman who had once hidden behind scarves and avoided eye contact now moved through the community with easy confidence, equally comfortable discussing business development with town officials and playing games with children at the local school. Her transformation was complete, but also ongoing, representing not a fixed achievement, but a continuous process of growth and discovery. The dance that evening, for, of course, there had to be a dance, was different from those magical first performances that had catalyzed Clara's transformation. This time, she moved with assured grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, her scars visible but irrelevant, her joy unguarded and infectious. The community that had first embraced her as a curious visitor now welcomed her as a returning friend and valued partner in their ongoing development. When the familiar notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" filled the air, Clara and Ethan took the floor with easy familiarity of old friends celebrating shared memories and continued connection. Mr. Harrison watched from the same position he had occupied months earlier, but his expression was entirely different. Instead of the shocked recognition of his own limitations, his face showed quiet pride and deep satisfaction. His daughter had not only recovered from the trauma that had once defined her life, but had transformed that experience into empathy and wisdom that served others facing similar challenges. The protective isolation he had once thought necessary had been replaced by engaged connection, and Clara's happiness was no longer something he needed to provide, but something she generated through her own choices and relationships. As the evening concluded and Clara prepared for an extended stay in Maplewood to oversee the Foundation's initial projects, her farewells were those of someone beginning a new chapter rather than ending an old one. The transformation that had begun with a single dance had evolved into a complete reimagining of how she understood success, purpose, and community. The young woman who had once measured her worth by what she could hide now evaluated her contributions by what she could offer, her scars serving not as sources of shame, but as bridges of understanding with others who had faced their own challenges. The story that had begun with a CEO's daughter hiding from the world had become an account of a community leader working to ensure that others wouldn't have to hide, that small towns could thrive without losing their essential character, that business success could serve human flourishing rather than simply extracting maximum profit. Clara's dance had indeed broken her father's pride, but it had also rebuilt it on a foundation of genuine accomplishment and social contribution rather than mere financial accumulation. Mr. Harrison's final conversation with Ethan that evening carried the weight of genuine friendship rather than mere gratitude. The businessman, who had once dismissed the diner owner as beneath his notice, now sought his advice on matters of community development and corporate responsibility. Their handshake was firm and equal, acknowledgement of a relationship based on mutual respect rather than social hierarchy. "You gave me my daughter back," Mr. Harrison said, repeating words that had concluded their first meaningful conversation. "But more than that, you showed both of us what success really looks like when it serves something larger than itself." The song had indeed broken her father's pride, but it had also taught them both that some forms of wealth couldn't be measured in dollars, that some forms of success couldn't be purchased with power, and that some forms of healing could only occur in the context of authentic community connection. The dance that had begun as a moment of personal courage had become a model for how individuals and institutions could choose vulnerability over protection, service over dominance, and shared prosperity over individual accumulation. In the end, the single dad waiter's invitation to dance had demonstrated the transformative power of communities that choose acceptance over judgment, inclusion over exclusion, and love over fear.